For learning target number 2, our task is to try to attempt to trace the political and economic changes that occurred in China from the Communist Revolution in 1950 until recent times. The hope with this PowerPoint is to give you some sense of the civil war that occurred in China and to identify some of the modern issues that China is facing. Before the outbreak of World War II, China was vulnerable to invasions, and thus when the Japanese came marching in the late 1930s, it was easy for them to come in and overtake Manchuria and then other northern and coastal parts of China. During this time period, the Chinese government was not well established, it was not centralized, and it was not powerful. It is at this time that you have two distinct military camps that are formed, one led by Mao Zedong, the Communist Party, and the other led by Chiang Kai-shek, who is of the Nationalist group. As the war progressed, these two forces joined somewhat to try to take on the Japanese invaders and are somewhat successful, eventually needing Allied support to fully overrun the Japanese and kick them out. More about this communist revolution that will result after the war is found in Chapter 36 of Section 2 in your book. Please read that at this point if you have not done so and complete the accompanying worksheet. This will help you understand how Mao Zedong was able to essentially beat out Chiang Kai-shek for control of China. And now we will turn to some of the various issues that modern China is facing. Some of these topics may be topics that you would choose to look at a little bit more closely for projects that you'd like to make a product for. After World War II, the political landscape of China and its neighbors changes dramatically. After the loss in World War II, Japan is reduced to its 4 major islands. In Korea, you will have, of course, an outbreak of war between basically North and South Korea that will pin communist northern forces against Republican southern forces. This eventually will pull the Soviet Union in and the United States in, and you essentially have what we call, of course, a proxy war that occurs for several years in the early 50s. After the end of this war, you have the formal division of the North and the South, which still continues to be an issue today. After the war in China, you have Mao Zedong with the communist forces taking on the nationalist forces. Eventually, as you guys have read in your book, the communists are victorious in 1949, and the nationalists are forced to flee to the area known as Taiwan. Taiwan continues to be an area of concern as far as human rights violations are concerned, and China still attempts to control Taiwan. And really that fight continues as far as who is truly in charge of that location. China has some territorial domain issues. They will occupy the region known as Tibet, which forces the Dalai Lama, when he is 15 years old, to take his people and essentially flee. And they will also control some other areas listed there. China will eventually reclaim the colonial strongholds of Hong Kong in 1997 and Macau in 1999. These were previously held by other major colonial powers, and the treaties do not essentially expire until the 90s, and that's when China gets those locations back. One tends to hear quite a bit about China and its environmental concerns. One of the biggest issues they've had is controlling water and at the same time trying to deal with new forms of energy. Flooding and dam building in China has long been an important part of its geographical concerns. China's Yangtze River is, of course, an important resource, but thanks to its size and scope, it's the 3rd largest volume sized river in the world. It is very prone to flooding and can cause quite a bit of destruction, but obviously provide quite a bit of an important resource. One of the things that they attempt to do with the Yangtze is build the Three Gorges Dam, which is not without controversy. It is considered the world's largest hydroelectric dam. It was finally completed in 2006. The main purpose behind it was, of course, to control flooding of the Yangtze and to generate electricity. The problem is that when they put it into place, it required flooding of certain locations that displaced over 1 million people. It flooded a major scenic attraction along the way, and it, of course, threatened different animal species. I guess the trade-off is, of course, the electricity component and the prevention of flooding in other locations, but it still continues to be an area of concern for Chinese citizens. If you look at this map, you can see some of the various locations of environmental concern for China. One of the biggest issues, of course, that they are dealing with is their increased carbon emissions. They are predominantly fueling their factories still to this day with coal, and we know that those emissions are incredibly harmful. It's not unusual to have smog reports to the point where people have to wear masks a majority of the time when they go outside. They did surpass the United States in carbon emissions in 2007. As far as rice, corn, and wheat crops are concerned, there is an element of concern that they will decline as much as 37%, most likely from the effects of global warming or acid rainfall. They are working supposedly toward a cleaner energy, and they certainly have been pushed to do so by the international community. The technology is there, they just have to be willing to put it into their factories. Their neighbors, Japan, South Korea, and Taiwan, are relatively energy efficient and clean. They use quite a bit of different types of energy sources, and some of that might be because they have smaller locations and they want to deal with that, deal with these issues a little bit more locally. Also, areas like Japan have stricter environmental laws, and some of their dirtier factories that would have coal emissions, they've shipped to different locations. So China has a way to go, to say the least, and unfortunately the communist government there will deny at times that they have bad air pollution, which the pictures really don't lie. So if you get a chance, Google some of those images. You'll be a little shocked by what people are living in. And certainly look at this map and kind of expand it on your iPad to see some of the other issues, including deforestation and certainly the flooding of the Yangtze River. The issue of religion in China is not a new one, but some people might be a bit surprised to learn that Confucianism still has an element of a stronghold in China. China, of course, being a communist government, does not recognize an official state religion. That's really not part of the communist format. But many people still identify themselves as either Buddhist or Confucius or some of the other religions. Confucianism, if you're looking at it once again as a philosophy, it was developed by Confucius, a man named Confucius, and still has a strong influence. And one of the reasons is because Chinese people will say, well, I follow the philosophy of Confucianism, and they can kind of get away with that because it's not being deemed as a religion, and therefore it's okay. It tends to have more influence in China and Korea than Japan. Japan had its own religion or philosophy. In the early 1900s, people started to begin to question in China kind of the value of Confucian ideas, particularly the part that focuses on relationships and how you should have obedience to authority, and authority figures should act in a caring manner, and that there's really this relationship between people that needs to exist for a country to be successful. They also do focus on education as an important part, and that has still maintained a level of support. In the era of Chinese economic growth, it still suggests that there's a support system that comes from Confucianism for things like education and social stability, but are they still an advantage? And certainly China finds itself in a bit of a flux as far as how much of that philosophy they still want to embrace as part of their daily existence. While the end of the Cold War certainly shifted some of the battle zones as far as proxy wars between the United States and the U.S. were concerned, you do have a China that remains communist, although it's perhaps not fully communist in the sense of countries like North Korea. They are communist, but they have a very strong capitalist component, and their economic growth certainly has kind of shifted the balance of power in that region, particularly more so to the coastal regions of China. Another thing that China has done is increased its military budget quite a bit in the past probably 50 years. They do have the world's largest army. They do have nuclear weapons capabilities, and they certainly have missile technology that outpaces other parts of the world, including the U.S. in some areas. So while they remain a very important trading partner with us, we are always, kind of keeping an eye on their military, because certainly they could be a viable threat if that relationship ever goes sour. One of the areas of concern for the U.S. and other countries is the human rights issues in China. We have been very critical, but not critical to the point where it would impact our relationship, certainly our trade relationship. Our relationships are improving with them as far as the human rights issue, but to be honest, there are still quite a few human rights violations that occur. One of the things that China, kind of the positions they take is supposedly, we won't mess with your issues, so don't mess with our issues. So they maintain a level of isolationism, so to speak. They don't want to get involved on a global scale as far as human rights concerns are concerned, rather, but they certainly have some problems. But their trading network and their trading power is much more important to us as a country, I guess you could say, than their human rights, even though that doesn't seem to be very morally good. As far as their economic development is concerned, under communism, after communists came into play in 1949, they had something called the Great Leap Forward, which unfortunately resulted in the death of 20 million people. You can read more about this certainly in your book, but basically this referred to a cultural revolution that occurred in the 1960s. Unfortunately, many of those individuals were sent to quote-unquote re-education camps to never appear. Now in kind of the modern era, in the late 80s into the 90s and 2000s, you have a China that is moving towards a post-communist economy. They are attempting to seek closer relations with the world, experimenting with elements of capitalism, but they still have a communist system in which they are working under. But certainly they are much more capitalist in nature nowadays than they were even 20 years ago. They do have some industrial reforms that are occurring. They have locations known as special economic zones, or SEZs, which are welcome to foreign investments. That's a new thing for China. A lot of their history as far as the economy was one that of isolationism. They do measure their economic growth at around 10% in some of these zones, and because of these zones being created. In different social and regional locations in China, some groups are benefiting more than others. Certainly coastal regions are benefiting more in some of the more industrial areas. And you have a situation that's not surprising in the capitalist type economy, that you have the elites benefiting far more than the poor. China is a heavily populated country, and you have a very, very large peasantry, particularly in the western and southern provinces, and that continues to be an area of concern. We will see in really the next several decades how that plays out. The social conditions in China have improved a bit since the 1940s. They have made some progress in medical care for their population, and education has increased as well. However, poverty persists, and the well-being of a group of individuals varies quite a bit from region to region. If you guys can kind of look at the map to the right, shows the gross domestic product for each of those areas, and certainly the areas that have a higher GDP are indicative of a province that has more wealth and the people are doing better. Their population issues still abound. They have 1.3 billion people. The one-child policy that's been in place for decades in China still favors males, which unfortunately has led to high adoption. I can't even say adoption rates, abandonment of female babies, or infanticide, where you essentially have abortions of female children. And this has led, unfortunately, to gender imbalance and some other unintended consequences in China. There has been a little bit of loosening of that lately, and that might be an area of interest for people to study. I ask you, after you finish this PowerPoint, to watch the YouTube clip there. You'll probably have to copy and paste it into a search engine. And it talks about the one-child policy in China and the good and bad of it. And there will be a worksheet listed in the unit or the lesson Learn Target 2 folder for you to fill out as you go with the documentary. And then finally, the position of women in China. Historically, they've held a low rank in society, but they have increased numbers in the workforce as of late, particularly as China becomes a more global empire.